I stand in the middle of a room shaped like a circle within a circle. Above me, the ceiling is made of glass that shows the stars outside, cold and endless. Around me sit the members of the Galactic Council, each one from a different world, each one looking at me the same way. Not with anger, not with hate, with something worse, pity. My name is Adrian Voss, and I am the last ambassador Earth will ever send to this place. I did not know that when I woke up this morning. I put on my formal coat, the deep blue one with silver thread at the collar, the one my daughter helped me choose before I left home 3 years ago. I remember her small hands smoothing down the fabric, telling me I looked like someone important. I believed her then. I am not sure I believe her now. The room is called the Sun Dome. It sits at the center of Council Prime, a station built from pieces of 100 different worlds, joined together over thousands of years. Some walls are stone, some are metal I cannot name. Some seem to breathe, gently, like the walls themselves are alive. I used to find this place beautiful. Today it feels like the inside of a cage. There are 11 seats in the high circle, one for each of the founding species of the council. Only 9 are filled today. 2 have been empty since before I was born, left that way for reasons no one ever explained to me. Humanity was given a seat only 40 years ago, the newest and smallest voice in the room. Now, I think, that seat is about to be taken away. The speaker of the council is a tall being named Threll, with skin like brushed copper and eyes that never seem to blink. Threll has always been polite to me. Polite but distant, the way someone is polite to a child they do not expect to grow up. Ambassador Voss, Threll says, and the whole room goes quiet. The council has reached its decision. I nod. I do not trust my voice yet, so I wait. Humanity's request for continued membership in the Unity Accord has been reviewed, Threll continues. The evidence has been weighed. The vote has been counted. I already know what is coming. I knew it 3 days ago, when the council stopped answering my messages and started speaking only through formal channels. I knew it when my own translator, the small device clipped to my collar, began receiving council broadcasts marked historical record instead of active negotiation. They had already decided. This meeting is only a formality, a way for them to say the words out loud so the record shows it was done properly. By a vote of 7-2, Threll says, the council has ruled that the human species is not yet fit to remain within the Unity Accord. Effective immediately, all trade agreements, technology exchanges, and diplomatic protections extended to Earth and its colonies are revoked. Humanity is hereby withdrawn from galactic society. Withdrawn. Such a soft word for what this really is. I look around the circle. Some of the delegates will not meet my eyes. A few look almost sad, in whatever way their strange faces can show sadness. One, a council member named Koresh from a world of deep oceans, actually looks away entirely, staring at the floor as if ashamed. But shame does not change a vote. It never has. May I speak? I ask. Threll hesitates, then nods once. You may. I take a breath. I had prepared a speech for this moment. 3 different versions, actually, each one longer and angrier than the last. I had planned to argue, to remind them of everything humanity had given to this council, the trade routes we opened, the conflicts we helped resolve, the small kindnesses that never made it into any official record. I had planned to fight. But standing here now, looking at 9 faces that have already made up their minds, I understand that none of it matters. The decision was never really about evidence. It was about fear. So instead, I say something much simpler. You are afraid of us. The room does not move. No one speaks. I continue. You call us unstable. You call us unpredictable. You say we have not learned to control ourselves the way your peoples have. And maybe you are right. We are young. We are loud. We build things too fast and break things too easily. We have never been very good at sitting still. I pause, letting the silence stretch a little longer than is comfortable. But I think the real problem is that you cannot predict what we will become. Every other species in this council grew up under rules that were already written before they arrived. You had elders to guide you, systems already in place, a galaxy that was mostly settled and mostly calm. We did not have that. We built everything ourselves, out of nothing, in less time than it took some of your worlds to agree on a single law. That frightens you, not because we are dangerous, because we are fast. Threll's copper face remains unreadable, but I notice the delegate beside him, a small being named Orin who has always liked humans, lower his head slightly, as if in agreement he is not allowed to say out loud. You are not casting us out, I say, my voice steady now. You are letting us go. No one responds to that. Perhaps they think it is simply a bitter man trying to save face. Perhaps some of them understand exactly what I mean. I will never know. Because a moment later, Threll rises from the high seat, and the ceremony of my defeat begins in earnest. The council thanks Ambassador Voss for his service. Threll says, in the same tone one might use to thank a servant for clearing a table. Humanity's embassy on Council Prime will be closed within 72 hours. All human vessels currently within Council-controlled space will be escorted back to Sol territory. Star charts beyond the boundary marked in the Unity Accord will no longer be shared with human navigators. Star charts. That single sentence is the true weapon. Without shared charts, without access to the safe lanes the Council has mapped over thousands of years, humanity will be trapped. Not physically caged, not exactly, but functionally alone. Cut off from the wider galaxy the way a child is cut off from a conversation happening in a language they do not speak. This session is concluded, Threll says. Just like that, it is over. 40 years of humanity's presence among the stars ended in a room that took perhaps 20 minutes to seal our fate. I am escorted out by 2 council guards, tall, silent figures whose faces are hidden behind smooth plates of some pale material. They do not speak to me, and I do not try to speak to them. There is nothing left to say that would change anything. The corridors of Council Prime are just as busy as they always are. Delegates from a dozen different worlds move past me, some in conversation, some alone. None of them paying any attention to the human walking among them for what might be the last time. I wonder if any of them know what just happened in the Sun Dome. I wonder if they would care even if they did. I stop at a viewing window near the edge of the station, one of the few places where a person can look out at open space without a guard watching over their shoulder. Earth is not visible from here, of course. It is too far. But somewhere out there, past 100,000 stars I cannot name, my daughter is waiting for me to come home. I think about what I will tell her. I think about what I will tell all of them, the millions of people back home who trusted their government to keep Earth's place among the stars secure. How do you explain to a child that the adults in charge of the galaxy decided her species was not good enough to sit at their table? How do you explain that we are now, officially and completely, alone? I do not have an answer yet. Perhaps I never will. A voice interrupts my thoughts. Ambassador Voss. I turn to find Koresh standing a short distance away, the Ocean World delegate who looked away from me during the vote. Koresh's skin shimmers faintly under the station lights, a pattern of blues and greens that shifts with each small movement. I am no longer an ambassador, I say, not as of 20 minutes ago. I know, Koresh says quietly. I wanted to speak with you before you leave. I wait. I am not in the mood for pleasantries, but something in Koresh's tone tells me this is not simply politeness. I voted against the withdrawal, Koresh says. So did Orin. It was not enough. I saw, I say. Thank you for that at least. Koresh hesitates, glancing around the corridor as if checking for anyone listening. The others are more afraid than they will admit, Ambassador. I do not think this decision was truly about your species being unstable. I think it was about your species not needing us the way the others do. I frown. What do you mean? Every species in the Unity Accord relies on the shared systems the Council maintains. Trade routes, defense agreements, resource distribution. It creates balance, yes, but it also creates dependence. Humanity has always been different. You arrived already building your own ships, developing your own technology, solving your own problems without waiting for permission. Some among the Council see that independence as a threat to the order they have spent thousands of years maintaining. I let that sink in. It matches what I said back in the Sun Dome, though hearing it confirmed by someone inside the system makes it feel more real, and somehow colder. So they cut us off, I say slowly. Not because we are dangerous, but because we might become powerful enough that we would not need them. Koresh does not answer directly, but the silence is answer enough. For what it is worth, Koresh says after a moment, I do not believe this ends here. I do not know what will happen to your people, cut off from the rest of us, but I do not believe humanity simply disappears quietly. I have watched your species work for many years now. You do not stay in the dark for long. I want to feel comforted by those words, but mostly I feel tired. Tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. Thank you, Koresh, I say. I hope you are right. Koresh nods once, then turns and walks away, leaving me alone at the window once more. I stand there for a long time, watching the stars, though none of them are ones I recognize. I think about the 72 hours we have been given to close the embassy. I think about the ships that will escort us home like prisoners being returned to their cell. I think about the star charts that will no longer be shared, the safe lanes that will close behind us like a door swinging shut. And strangely, underneath the grief and the anger, I feel something else beginning to stir. Something small. Something I am almost afraid to name. Not despair. Not yet. Something closer to resolve. Perhaps Koresh is right. Perhaps this is not truly an ending, but the closing of one chapter before another begins, one we cannot yet imagine. I do not know what humanity will become, cut off from the wider galaxy, forced to rely entirely on ourselves. I do not know if we will fall apart under the weight of our own mistakes, the way the Council seems to expect, or if, given enough time and enough reason, we will become something the galaxy has never seen before. I gather my coat, the blue one with silver thread, and walk back toward the human embassy to begin the work of closing it down. There is a ship waiting to take me home, guided by Council escorts who will watch us all the way to the edge of Sol territory and no further. Behind me, the sun dome fades into the crowded corridors of Council Prime, just another room among thousands, holding a decision that will echo far longer than anyone inside it understands. Ahead of me lies Earth, and a future none of us can yet see. I do not know, standing at that window with the weight of an entire species pressing down on my shoulders, that centuries from now, my name will be remembered not as the ambassador who lost humanity's place among the stars, but as the man who stood in that room and spoke the words that would one day come true. You are not casting us out, you are letting us go. I only know, in this moment, that I have a long journey home, and an entire world waiting to hear news I do not yet know how to deliver. I was 11 years old when my father came home from the stars for the last time. My name is Elena Voss, and though I did not understand it then, I now know that the day my father returned from Council Prime was the day the old world ended and a new one began. I remember him walking through our front door, still wearing that blue coat with silver thread at the collar, looking older than he had when he left 3 years before. I remember running to hug him, and I remember the strange, heavy silence that followed when he did not smile the way he always used to. That was the beginning of what historians now call the Long Dark. I lived through all of it, and I am writing this account many years later, not as a historian, but as someone who was simply there, watching my world change in ways no one expected. The first months after the withdrawal were the hardest. Earth had spent 40 years growing used to the comforts the Council provided. Shared trade routes brought resources we could not easily produce ourselves. Shared technology filled gaps in our own research. Even simple things, like weather prediction systems that used data gathered from a dozen worlds, had quietly become part of daily life. When the Council cut ties, all of it disappeared overnight. I remember the food shortages first. Certain crops, engineered with help from Council agricultural science, began failing without the specialized nutrients we had once imported. I remember my mother standing in long lines at the market, holding my hand tightly, her face tight with worry she tried to hide from me. I remember hearing adults argue on the street corners, blaming the government, blaming the Council, blaming each other. There were riots in some cities during that first winter. Not everywhere, but enough that the news carried images of broken windows and angry crowds late into the night. People were frightened, and frightened people often turn on whatever is nearest to them. For a while it seemed as though humanity might tear itself apart from the inside, doing exactly what the Council had always feared we would do. My father did not speak much about those early months. He had been given a position on the newly formed Unity Council of Earth, a group of representatives from every major nation, gathered together for the first time not to discuss trade with alien worlds, but to figure out how humanity would survive without them. He worked long hours, often not coming home until well after I had gone to sleep. When I did see him, he looked tired in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than simply missing rest. One evening, I asked him if we were going to be all right. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, folding his hands together, the way he always did when he was about to say something important. "Elena," he said, "do you know why the Council decided to send us away?" I shook my head. "They said we were not ready, that we did not yet know how to control ourselves, how to work together the way the older worlds have learned to. And do you know something? For a little while there, watching the riots on the news, I thought maybe they were right. I remember feeling a small chill at those words, coming from my own father. But then I remembered something," he continued. "Humanity did not wait for the Council's permission to build our first ships. We did not wait for permission to cure our worst diseases, or to explore our own oceans, or to learn how to grow food in places nothing was ever supposed to grow. We have never needed anyone's permission to become better than we were yesterday. We only need time, and a reason to try." I did not fully understand what he meant back then. I understand it now. Over the following 2 years, something began to shift. Slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. The chaos of the first winter gave way to something steadier, guided in large part by a woman named Amara Reyes, who would later become known as the first true architect of what humanity would eventually become. Amara Reyes was not a soldier, nor a scientist, nor even a career politician before the withdrawal. She had been an engineer working on water reclamation systems in a coastal city that had been hit particularly hard by the shortages. When local officials failed to organize a fair distribution system during the worst of the crisis, Amara stepped in, quietly rallying neighbors, restructuring supply lines using nothing more than careful planning and stubborn persistence. Her small solution worked so well that word of it spread to nearby districts, then nearby nations, until eventually she was invited to sit on the very same Unity Council of Earth where my father worked. I met her once, briefly, when she came to our home to discuss something with my father late one evening. I remember her sharp eyes and her calm, steady voice, the way she seemed to listen more than she spoke. My father later told me that Amara had a gift for finding order inside chaos, for seeing patterns where others only saw disaster. It was Amara Reyes who first proposed what would eventually become known as the Unity Doctrine, a set of principles meant to guide humanity through the isolation the Council had forced upon us. I did not understand the full weight of her words until I was much older, but I remember the speech she gave when the doctrine was first announced publicly, broadcast to every screen on the planet. "We have been told we are not ready," she said, standing before a gathering of world leaders and ordinary citizens alike. "We have been told that we lack the discipline of older civilizations, the patience of species who have had thousands of years to settle their differences. Perhaps that is true. But I do not believe patience is something only time can teach. I believe it can also be taught by necessity." She went on to describe a new way of organizing humanity's efforts, not through the old competitive systems that had once divided nations against each other, but through cooperation born of shared survival. Resources would be pooled. Research would be shared openly between all nations rather than hoarded for individual advantage. Military forces, once scattered and competing, would slowly merge into something unified, not for the purpose of conquest, but for the purpose of protection against a universe that had already shown it could turn its back on us without warning. It was not an easy transition. Old rivalries did not disappear overnight simply because a woman gave a good speech. There were disagreements, sometimes bitter ones, between nations who had spent centuries distrusting each other. I remember my father coming home exhausted many nights, describing arguments that had stretched on for hours over seemingly small details, disagreements that threatened to collapse the fragile cooperation Amara had worked so hard to build. But slowly, the shared crisis did what decades of diplomacy never could. Humanity began to unify, not out of idealism, but out of necessity. When you are cut off from an entire galaxy, when you know that no one is coming to help if things go wrong, you begin to see your neighbors differently. The nation across the border stops looking like a rival, and starts looking like the only other people who understand exactly what you are going through. By the time I was 15, the worst of the shortages had passed. Scientists across the globe, no longer able to rely on Council technology, began working on solutions using nothing but human ingenuity and whatever raw materials we had access to within our own solar system. I remember visiting a research facility with my father, now serving in a more senior role within the growing Unity government, and seeing scientists working on early designs for engines that did not depend on any Council blueprint at all. It was slow, difficult work, full of failures and setbacks, but there was an energy in that facility I had never felt before, a sense that we were building something entirely our own. I think that was the true turning point of the Long Dark, though no one called it that at the time. It was not a single dramatic moment, but a quiet shift in attitude that spread slowly across the entire species. The despair of those first months began to transform into something else entirely. Determination, perhaps, or maybe simply stubbornness. The same trait the Council had once called a flaw, now becoming humanity's greatest strength. My father once told me a story about the last Council ship to ever leave Earth's orbit, the same escort vessels that had guided him home after the withdrawal. He said he stood on a rooftop with several other members of the newly forming government, watching the ship's lights fade into the night sky, marking the true and final end of any connection to the wider galaxy. There was a satellite, he told me, one of the old communication relays we had used to stay in contact with Council networks. As soon as that ship crossed beyond the boundary marked in the old agreements, the satellite simply went dark. No message. No warning. It was as if someone had reached out and pulled a curtain closed between us and everyone else out there. He said the group standing with him on that rooftop stood in silence for a long time after the satellite's lights disappeared. No one spoke. There did not seem to be anything worth saying. But then, my father continued, someone in the group, I do not even remember who, said something that stayed with me ever since. They said, "Well then, I suppose we had better learn to light our own way." I have thought about that phrase many times over the years. I have watched it become something like an unofficial motto for the generation that lived through those difficult first years of isolation. We had better learn to light our own way. It was simple, almost too simple, but it captured something true about what humanity was becoming. By the time the Long Dark truly ended, several years after that lonely night on the rooftop, humanity had changed in ways that would have surprised even the Council members who once judged us so harshly. We were no longer divided into competing nations pulling in different directions. We were not perfect, not united in every way, but we had learned to work together in ways we never had before, driven by the simple understanding that no one else was coming to save us if we failed. Amara Reyes would go on to become the first chancellor of what was then called the Unified Terran Assembly, the governing body that would eventually oversee humanity's earliest expansion beyond our own solar system. My father served alongside her for many years, helping shape policies that would guide our species through the difficult work of rebuilding technology and infrastructure without any outside help. I was still young during those years, but I remember watching my father grow into someone new. The tired, defeated man who had returned from Council Prime slowly transformed into someone with a quiet, steady determination, the same kind of determination I began to see reflected across our entire species. We had been told we were not ready for the galaxy. Perhaps in that first terrible winter, we truly were not. But something had shifted in us during those difficult years, something the Council could never have predicted. I did not understand it fully at the time, but looking back now, I believe the Long Dark was not simply a period of suffering and struggle. It was the forge in which humanity's future was quietly being shaped, hammer strike by hammer strike, mistake by mistake, until something new and unexpected began to take form. The Council thought they were closing a door on a species too young and too unstable to join the wider galaxy. What they did not realize, what none of them could have predicted, was that behind that closed door, humanity was quietly learning how to build an entirely new one. I did not know it then, watching my father grow tired and gray during those difficult years, but the seeds of something much larger than anyone imagined were already being planted. Somewhere in laboratories across the globe, in quiet meetings between former rivals now working as allies, in speeches given by a determined woman who refused to let despair win, humanity was slowly preparing for a future none of us could yet see clearly. We had been left alone in the dark, and in that darkness we were learning, slowly and painfully, how to build our own light. My name is Elena Voss, and I was 26 years old when I watched humanity break the last rule the Council ever gave us. I have already told you about my father, Adrian Voss, the ambassador who stood in the Sundome and watched our species get cast out of galactic society. I have told you about the Long Dark, the years of hunger and fear that followed, and how a woman named Amara Reyes helped guide humanity through its darkest winter. Now I want to tell you what came after. I want to tell you about the years when we stopped simply surviving and started building. By the time I finished my engineering studies, the worst of the crisis had long passed. I had grown up hearing stories about food shortages and street riots, but by the time I was old enough to understand the world properly, humanity had settled into something steadier. Nations that once distrusted each other now shared laboratories and research facilities. The old competitive spirit that had divided us for centuries had not disappeared entirely, but it had been reshaped into something more useful. Instead of competing against each other, we were competing against the silence the Council had left behind. I joined the Deep Systems Research Division shortly after graduation, a research body formed specifically to solve one problem that had haunted humanity since the withdrawal. How does a species travel between stars without any help from those who already know how? The Council had never shared the details of their faster-than-light technology with us, not fully. During the 40 years we spent as members of the Unity Accord, we were given limited access to certain travel lanes and navigation charts, but the actual engineering behind Council ships remained a closely guarded secret. It was, I later learned, one of the ways older species maintained their advantage over younger ones. Give them just enough technology to be useful trading partners, but never enough to become truly independent. When the Council withdrew, they took that limited access away completely. We were left with old memories of ships we had seen but never fully understood, fragments of theory scattered across scientific papers written by hopeful researchers who had never been allowed to see the true engineering behind it all. My mentor at Deep Systems was a woman named Dr. Farida Amir, a brilliant physicist who had lost her research position at a Council-funded university during the withdrawal. She was one of many scientists who found themselves suddenly without resources, without funding, and without the specialized equipment they had once relied upon. Rather than give up, she gathered a small team of equally stubborn colleagues and began working from nothing, piecing together theories using whatever equipment humanity could build on its own. I remember my first day walking into her laboratory, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of what used to be called Geneva. The building was cold, and half the equipment looked as though it had been assembled from spare parts scavenged from a dozen different sources. Dr. Amir herself looked exhausted, her hair streaked with more gray than her age should have allowed, but her eyes held a fierce determination I had rarely seen in anyone before. "Ah," she said, looking up from a cluttered desk covered in handwritten notes. "You must be Adrian Voss's daughter." I nodded, a little surprised she knew my father's name. "Your father spoke at a gathering I attended years ago," she explained. "Right after the withdrawal, he said something I have never forgotten. He said humanity does not need permission to become better than we were yesterday. We only need time and a reason to try. I smiled, recognizing the words. He used to say that to me at our kitchen table. Well, Dr. Amir said, gesturing toward the cluttered laboratory around her. Welcome to the reason to try. The work itself was slow and often frustrating. Unlike the Council, who had thousands of years of established science to draw upon, we were working almost entirely from first principles. We knew Council ships could travel faster than light because we had seen them do it, but we did not know exactly how. We had theories, of course, built from centuries of human physics research, but theories are not the same as working engines. I spent the first 2 years of my career mostly failing. I remember countless nights spent staring at equations that refused to balance, prototypes that drained more power than entire cities could safely provide, tests that ended not in triumph but in small, disappointing fizzles of energy that told us we were still missing something fundamental. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from failing at something important over and over again, while knowing that an entire species is depending on you to eventually succeed. I felt that exhaustion many times during those years. I remember calling my father late one night, nearly in tears after a particularly difficult failure, telling him I did not know if we would ever solve the problem at all. He listened patiently, the way he always did, and then he told me something I have carried with me ever since. Elena, he said, do you know what the Council's greatest weakness truly is? I shook my head, even though he could not see me over the call. They have never had to fail the way we are failing now. They inherited most of their knowledge from species that came before them, passed down over thousands of years, refined slowly and carefully, with very little risk involved. They have forgotten what it means to build something entirely from nothing. We have not forgotten, because we never had the luxury of forgetting. Every failure you experience tonight is teaching you something the Council itself no longer remembers how to learn. Those words stayed with me through many more difficult nights. Slowly, painfully, our small team at Deep Systems began to make progress. Where Council engineering favored elegant, refined solutions built upon a long and stable tradition, our own approach became something different entirely. We built in redundancy, layering backup systems upon backup systems, because we could not afford the luxury of assuming anything would work perfectly the first time. We embraced brute force solutions when elegant ones eluded us, willing to accept a clumsy but functional design over an elegant but incomplete one. It was Dr. Amir who first noticed the pattern in our failures, the piece of the puzzle that had been eluding us for years. Council ships, she theorized, likely used a single unified field to bend the fabric of space around the vessel, an elegant solution that required extremely precise calibration to maintain safely. Our own attempts had been trying to replicate that same elegant approach, and failing every time because we lacked the generations of refined engineering needed to achieve that level of precision. What if, she said one evening, staring at a whiteboard covered in equations, we stopped trying to bend space perfectly, and instead simply overwhelm it imperfectly? It sounds like a small idea, but it changed everything. Rather than one single, precisely calibrated field, our new design used dozens of smaller, imperfect fields working together, each one compensating for the weaknesses of the others. It was clumsy. It was inefficient by any Council standard, but it worked, in a way that did not require the impossible precision we had been chasing for years. I remember the night of our first successful test more clearly than almost any other memory from that period of my life. We had built a small unmanned probe, barely larger than a shipping container, equipped with our new layered field design. The test was scheduled for just after midnight, in a remote testing facility far from any populated area, in case something went wrong. My brother Marcus had died 3 years earlier during a supply accident in one of the early asteroid mining operations that had become crucial to rebuilding humanity's resource base after the withdrawal. He had always been fascinated by the idea of humanity reaching the stars again, and I remember thinking of him often during those difficult years of research, wishing he could see the work we were doing. Dr. Amir stood beside me in the control room that night, her hands folded tightly together, watching the monitors with an intensity that matched my own. The probe sat on its launch platform outside, small and unremarkable, carrying within it years of failure and stubborn determination. "Initiate sequence," Dr. Amir said quietly. I pressed the command into the console, my hands trembling slightly. For a long moment nothing happened. The probe simply sat there, lights blinking steadily, giving no indication that anything unusual was occurring at all. Then, without any dramatic flash of light or sound, the probe simply vanished from its platform. The room fell completely silent. For a terrible moment I thought we had lost it entirely, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Then the monitors began to update, showing new position data streaming in from tracking stations positioned throughout our solar system. The probe had reappeared nearly the distance to Mars in less than the blink of an eye. I do not remember exactly what sound I made in that moment, whether it was laughter or crying or something in between, but I remember Dr. Amir gripping my shoulder tightly, her own eyes bright with tears she did not bother to hide. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." News of the successful test spread quickly through the small community of scientists and engineers who had been working on similar problems across the globe. Within months, our layered field design became the foundation for humanity's first true faster-than-light engine, refined and improved by teams working in dozens of countries, all sharing their findings openly under the cooperative research policies established during the Long Dark. I think often about how different our technology became from anything the Council had ever built. Where their ships were elegant, precise, almost delicate in their engineering, ours became something rugged and redundant, built to survive failure rather than avoid it entirely. It was, in its own strange way, a perfect reflection of the species that built it. We were not elegant. We were not refined by centuries of careful tradition. We were stubborn, adaptable, and unwilling to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. 2 years after that first successful test, I stood on a launch platform once again, though this time the stakes were far greater than a small unmanned probe. Humanity's first colony ship, the Horizon's Reach, sat ready for its maiden voyage beyond our own solar system, carrying nearly 1,000 volunteers who had chosen to leave everything behind for the uncertain promise of a new home among the stars. Dr. Amir had passed away just 8 months earlier, her health finally failing after decades of tireless work. I remember standing at her memorial service, surrounded by colleagues who had become like family over the years we had struggled together, feeling the weight of everything she had sacrificed to bring humanity to this moment. I had been given the honor of overseeing the final systems check before the Horizon's Reach departed, a small tribute to the work Dr. Amir and I had done together all those years earlier in that cold, cluttered warehouse laboratory. I remember placing my hand against the cool metal hull of the ship, thinking of my brother Marcus, thinking of my father who had once stood alone in a room full of judgment, thinking of Dr. Amir who had never lived to see this moment, but had made it possible through sheer stubborn brilliance. "For all of them," I whispered, before stepping back to allow the final launch sequence to begin. The Horizon's Reach lifted away from Earth's surface, climbing steadily into the dark sky above, carrying with it the hopes of an entire species that had been told, only a few decades earlier, that we were not fit to join the wider galaxy. I watched until the ship's lights disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vastness of space, knowing that somewhere beyond our solar system, humanity's true expansion was only just beginning. No one outside our solar system knew what we were building during those years. The Council, if they thought of us at all, likely imagined a species struggling simply to survive in isolation, exactly as they had predicted when they cast us out. They had no way of knowing that behind the boundary they had sealed us within, we were quietly developing the very technology that would eventually allow us to reach far beyond anything they could have imagined. I often think back to my father's words about the Council's greatest weakness, their inability to remember what it truly means to fail and rebuild from nothing. I think about how that single insight shaped everything humanity accomplished during those difficult years of isolation. We did not simply survive the Long Dark. We used it, transforming necessity into innovation, transforming exile into opportunity. Standing there that night, watching the Horizon's Reach vanish into the darkness, I did not know exactly what humanity would find waiting for us among the stars, or how long it would take before the wider galaxy discovered what we had quietly become. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we were no longer the same species the Council had judged unfit all those years ago. We had learned to light our own way, just as that unnamed voice on a rooftop had once promised. And now, for the first time since our banishment, that light was finally beginning to spread beyond the boundaries of our own solar system, carrying humanity's future toward stars none of us had ever seen before. My name is Kaya Voss, and I am the 4th generation of my family to serve among the stars since the day my great-great-grandfather stood alone in a room called the Sun Dome and watched the Galactic Council cast humanity aside. I never met Adrian Voss, of course. He died long before I was born, as did my great-grandmother Elena, the engineer who helped build the very ships that carried humanity beyond our home system for the first time. But their stories were passed down through my family, the way some families pass down old photographs or heirlooms. I grew up hearing about the Sun Dome, about the Long Dark, about the cold laboratory where a stubborn scientist named Dr. Amir first cracked the secret of layered field travel. By the time I was old enough to understand what those stories truly meant, humanity had already changed almost beyond recognition. I am writing this account from the bridge of the exploration vessel Meridian's Promise, currently stationed at the edge of what we call the Outer Reach, a vast stretch of space that humanity has quietly claimed as its own over the past several generations. I want to tell you about this period of our history, the years historians now call the silent expansion, because I believe it is the part of our story that shaped us most deeply, even though almost no one beyond our own systems knew it was happening at all. By the time I was born, humanity had spread across nearly 40 different systems, each one settled slowly and carefully over the decades following the Horizon's Reach's first successful voyage. My grandmother often told me that the early colonists who left Earth all those years ago carried with them a very particular kind of caution, one born directly from the lesson of the withdrawal. We had been found unworthy once by outsiders who barely understood us. No one wanted to risk being found again before we were ready. This caution shaped everything about how humanity expanded during those years. Rather than pushing outward in the most direct or efficient direction, our early explorers deliberately charted courses that avoided any system known or suspected to fall within Council-monitored space. It made expansion slower, certainly, and more difficult, but it also meant that for nearly a century, humanity grew almost entirely unnoticed by the wider galaxy. I remember asking my grandmother once why we bothered hiding at all. If humanity had grown strong enough to build ships and settle new worlds, why not simply announce ourselves to the galaxy and demand the respect we deserved? She smiled at me the way adults often do when a child asks a question far more complicated than they realize. "Kaya," she said, "imagine you spent your whole childhood being told by everyone around you that you were too weak, too unpredictable, too immature to be trusted with anything important. Now imagine that after years of hard work, you finally became strong enough to prove them wrong. Would you want to prove it to them the moment you took your very first steps, when you might still stumble and fall? Or would you rather wait until you could walk with such confidence that no one could ever doubt you again?" I understood then, at least a little. Humanity was not simply expanding during those years. We were preparing, quietly and carefully, for a moment we knew would eventually come, whether we chose it ourselves or had it forced upon us. Life across humanity's growing systems during the silent expansion was, in many ways, far different from the life my ancestors had known on Earth. Each new colony developed its own particular character, shaped by the environment of its world and the specific challenges its settlers faced. The mining colonies of the Ashen Belt grew tough and practical, valuing efficiency above almost everything else. The agricultural worlds of the Verdant Cluster developed a slower, more patient culture, deeply connected to the rhythms of growing seasons and careful stewardship of limited resources. The research station, scattered throughout what became known as the Scholar's Reach, attracted brilliant, restless minds who continued the work Dr. Amir had begun generations earlier, pushing our understanding of science and engineering further with each passing decade. Despite these differences, every human colony shared something in common, a thread that connected us across the growing distances between our worlds. We all carried the story of the exile, as it eventually came to be called, the tale of humanity's banishment from galactic society, and the long, difficult journey that followed. It became something more than simple history. It became a kind of founding myth, told and retold in slightly different versions depending on which world you visited, but always carrying the same essential truth at its core. We were cast out because we were feared, not because we were weak. We survived because we refused to accept the judgment placed upon us, and we would return to the wider galaxy only when we were ready to do so entirely on our own terms. I grew up on one such colony myself, a modest agricultural world called New Meridian, nestled safely within the Verdant Cluster. My parents were both scientists working on soil adaptation projects, helping ensure that crops brought from Earth generations earlier could continue thriving in the different conditions of our new home. I remember long afternoons spent in greenhouse fields, listening to my grandmother tell stories about ancestors I would never meet, while my parents worked nearby among rows of carefully tended plants. It was during my time at the Fleet Academy, when I was 19 years old, that I first began to understand just how large humanity's presence among the stars had truly grown. The Academy itself was located on a moon within the Scholar's Reach, a bustling hub of activity where young people from dozens of different colonies gathered to train as explorers, engineers, and eventually, fleet officers. I remember standing in the Academy's main hall during my first week, looking up at a massive star map that covered the entire ceiling, showing every system humanity had settled or explored since the Horizon's Reach first departed Earth so many generations earlier. I had known, in an abstract way, that humanity had grown significantly since the days of the Long Dark, but seeing it laid out so plainly, dozens of systems connected by careful trade routes and shared communication networks, made the true scale of our achievement finally clear to me. We were no longer a struggling species clinging to survival within a single solar system. We had become something far larger, though still carefully hidden from the wider galaxy that had once cast us aside. It was also during my years at the Academy that I first learned about our earliest encounters with other intelligent species beyond Earth, encounters that had occurred quietly over the decades of the silent expansion, carefully managed to avoid drawing attention from the Council itself. My favorite professor at the Academy was a woman named Dr. Hessa Okonkwo, who taught a course on First Contact Protocol, a subject that had become increasingly important as humanity's territory continued expanding into regions where other species occasionally crossed our path. Dr. Okonkwo had actually served on one of the earliest expeditions to make contact with a non-council species, a peaceful group called the Vantiri who lived on the edges of what would eventually become humanity's border territory. I remember her describing that first meeting during one of our lectures, the careful weeks of preparation, the deep uncertainty over how the encounter might unfold. Unlike humanity's original introduction to galactic society, which had been carefully managed by the Council according to their own established protocols, this meeting had no established rules to follow. It was simply humanity, alone, attempting to communicate with another species for the very first time, entirely on our own. We were terrified, Dr. Okonkwo admitted to our class, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. We had grown up hearing stories about how the Council judged us unworthy of galactic society. Some part of each of us worried that any other species we encountered might judge us the very same way. But the meeting with the Vantiri, she explained, unfolded very differently than anyone had expected. The Vantiri themselves were a cautious, curious species, having had only limited contact with the wider Council-governed galaxy themselves. They knew of the Council, certainly, but held no particular loyalty toward them. More importantly, they knew of humanity as well, though only through old stories and half-remembered rumors passed along by traders who occasionally ventured near the boundaries of what had once been our forbidden territory. They called us the Banished Ones, Dr. Okonkwo said, and I remember the room falling very quiet at those words. It was not meant as an insult. To the Vantiri, and to several other species living at the edges of Council influence, humanity had already become something of a legend, a species cast out by the great powers of the galaxy, who nonetheless survived and continued growing in the shadows, unseen and unbroken. I found myself deeply moved by that idea, that even in our silence, even while carefully hiding from the wider galaxy, humanity had already begun shaping a reputation among those who lived beyond the Council's direct control. We were not simply surviving in secret. We were becoming something of a story ourselves, half myth and half warning, whispered about in places we had never even visited. The meeting with the Vantiri marked the beginning of a slow, careful pattern that would continue throughout the rest of the silent expansion. Humanity made contact with several other independent species over the following decades, each encounter handled with the same careful caution that had defined our entire approach to expansion since the earliest days following our withdrawal from Council society. We shared knowledge where it was welcomed, offered assistance where it was needed, and always kept careful watch for any sign that word of our growing presence might reach the Council itself before we were ready. By the time I graduated from the Academy and received my first posting aboard an exploration vessel, humanity's territory had grown to include dozens of systems, and had developed careful relationships with several smaller, independent species living along our borders. We had built something remarkable during those quiet decades. An entire interconnected civilization spanning a significant portion of the galaxy, all while remaining almost entirely unknown to the very Council that had once cast us aside. I remember my first deep space assignment vividly, serving as a junior officer aboard a survey vessel tasked with mapping newly discovered systems along the furthest edge of our expanding territory. It was during this assignment that I first began to understand just how close we were coming to the boundary of what the Council still considered their own controlled space. Our captain, a steady, thoughtful woman named Elis Tamara, called a meeting of the senior officers one evening after our sensors detected faint energy readings consistent with old Council navigation beacons, still active despite having received no update or maintenance in centuries. "We are closer to their territory than any human vessel has come since the withdrawal," Captain Tamura told us, her expression carefully neutral. "Command has been aware for some time that this moment would eventually arrive. Humanity cannot expand forever without eventually crossing paths with the very civilization that once judged us unworthy of its company." I remember feeling a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension at those words. Every story I had grown up hearing about the Sun Dome, about my great-great-grandfather standing alone before a council that saw him as nothing more than a representative of a flawed, unstable species, suddenly felt closer and more real than it ever had before. "What happens now?" I asked, perhaps too eagerly for a junior officer still finding her place among more experienced colleagues. Captain Tamura considered the question carefully before answering. "Now," she said, "we continue exactly as we always have. We proceed with caution. We gather information. and we wait for the right moment, when humanity is finally ready to be found, rather than simply stumbled upon by accident. I did not know then just how soon that moment would arrive, or how dramatically it would change everything humanity had quietly built during those long decades of silent expansion. But standing on the bridge of that survey vessel, staring out at the faint, ancient signal of a council beacon, still broadcasting after centuries of neglect, I felt something shift deep within me. The same feeling I imagined that my great-great-grandfather must have felt standing in the Sundome all those generations earlier, though our circumstances could not have been more different. We were no longer the same species the Council had banished. We had grown, adapted, and built an entire civilization of our own, entirely beyond their knowledge or control. And though none of us could yet know exactly how or when it would happen, every person aboard that survey vessel understood, in that quiet moment, that humanity's long silence among the stars was finally, inevitably, coming to an end. My name is Kaya Voss, and I was the officer standing on the bridge when humanity chose, for the first time in over a century, to be found. I ended my last account describing the moment aboard the survey vessel Meridian's Promise when we detected the faint signal of an old Council navigation beacon, still broadcasting after centuries of neglect near the edge of our expanding territory. I want to continue that story now, because what followed those next several years changed everything humanity had quietly built during the long decades of what historians call the silent expansion. Captain Tamara did not rush into any decision after we detected that beacon. She was, above all else, a careful woman. Someone who understood that centuries of patient expansion could be undone by a single reckless choice. For nearly 2 years following that first discovery, our survey missions continued much as they always had, mapping systems, cataloging resources, occasionally exchanging careful greetings with smaller independent species we encountered along the way. But something had changed beneath the surface of those routine missions. Command back on our capital world, a thriving system we called Meridian Prime, had begun quietly preparing for what everyone now understood was inevitable. I was promoted to senior officer during this period, largely due to my growing expertise in old Council communication protocols, a subject I had studied extensively since my days at the Academy under Dr. Okonkwo. It became my responsibility to help decode the ancient signals we occasionally intercepted from that dormant beacon, and others like it scattered throughout the border regions, piecing together fragments of information about how the Council's monitoring systems actually functioned after all these centuries. What we discovered during those 2 years surprised many of our senior officials. The Council, it seemed, had grown complacent since the days of humanity's withdrawal. Their monitoring systems along this particular border region had received only minimal updates over the centuries, likely because the Council considered this stretch of space unimportant, too far from any significant trade routes or resource-rich systems to warrant close attention. It was in many ways the perfect blind spot, and it explained a great deal about how humanity had managed to expand so extensively without ever being noticed. But blind spots do not remain hidden forever, especially not when a civilization continues growing at the rate humanity had grown throughout the silent expansion. Eventually, someone was going to notice us, whether we chose the moment ourselves, or had it forced upon us by simple chance. It was Chancellor Priya Okafor, the leader of the Unified Terran Assembly during this period, who ultimately made the decision that would end humanity's long silence among the stars. I did not know Chancellor Okafor personally, of course, given the vast distances separating our border survey missions from the political center of humanity's growing civilization, but I remember well the broadcast she delivered to every corner of human-controlled space, a message I watched alongside my crewmates in the observation deck of our vessel, all of us holding our breath as her words filled the room. For over a century, Chancellor Okafor said, her voice steady and calm despite the enormous weight of what she was about to announce, humanity has grown in silence, hidden from the wider galaxy that once judged us unworthy of its company. We have built new worlds. We have formed careful friendships with other species who share our corner of the stars. We have become something far greater than the Council ever believed we could be. She paused, and I remember the silence in our observation deck stretching long and heavy as we waited for her next words. The time has come, she continued, for humanity to step out of the shadows we have carefully maintained for so long, not because we seek conflict with the Council that once cast us aside, not because we wish to prove a point through force or intimidation, but because hiding, no matter how carefully managed, is no longer who we are meant to be. We have earned our place among the stars through our own effort, our own ingenuity, and our own resilience. It is time the galaxy learned what humanity has become. I remember feeling a chill run through me at those words, a mixture of excitement and deep uncertainty about what would follow. Every story I had grown up hearing, about my great-great-grandfather standing alone in the Sundome, about the long years of struggle during the long dark, about the careful, quiet decades of expansion that followed, all of it seemed to be building toward this single moment. The plan Chancellor Okafor's government had developed was, in its own way, a masterpiece of careful diplomacy. Rather than allowing the Council to simply stumble upon humanity by accident, potentially triggering fear or misunderstanding, our government chose to control the moment of discovery entirely on our own terms. A single vessel, the diplomatic ship Continuum, was selected to make first contact, carrying representatives chosen specifically for this historic mission. I was, to my great surprise and considerable pride, selected to serve as a communications officer aboard the Continuum, largely due to my extensive knowledge of Council protocols, developed over years of studying those old intercepted signals. I remember receiving the assignment notice, hands trembling slightly as I read the details, understanding that I was about to become part of a moment that would be remembered for generations to come. The Continuum was unlike any vessel I had served aboard before, designed specifically for this singular purpose. It carried no weapons of any kind, a deliberate choice meant to demonstrate that humanity approached this reunion not as a threat, but as an equal member of galactic society, ready to re-establish contact on entirely peaceful terms. Its interior was designed with careful attention to comfort and diplomacy rather than practical exploration, meant to serve as a proper setting for what would surely become one of the most significant diplomatic meetings in humanity's history. Our journey toward the boundary of Council-monitored space took several weeks, time that our small diplomatic team spent in careful preparation, reviewing historical records of the withdrawal, studying updated intelligence about the current state of Council politics, and rehearsing various scenarios for how our eventual meeting might unfold. I spent much of that journey studying the same old speech my great-great-grandfather Adrian had given all those generations earlier. The words he spoke standing alone in the sun dome before the Council rendered their final judgment. "You are not casting us out. You are letting us go." I wondered often, during those long weeks of travel, what he would think if he could see what those words had ultimately led to. A single act of quiet defiance from a defeated ambassador, passed down through generations of my family, had somehow become the foundation for an entire civilization's approach to its return among the stars. We crossed the old boundary marked by the original Unity Accord on a quiet morning that felt, to me, entirely unremarkable given the enormous significance of the moment. There was no dramatic alarm, no sudden confrontation. We simply continued along our planned course, transmitting a carefully worded message on old Council communication frequencies that I had spent years learning to properly decode and now, for the first time, had the honor of properly using. The message itself was brief and carefully composed by our diplomatic team, avoiding any language that might suggest either weakness or aggression. It identified our vessel as a representative of the Unified Terran Assembly, formally requesting an audience with any Council authority present within range, and stating simply that humanity wished to re-establish formal contact with galactic society after a long period of separation. I remember the tense silence that followed our transmission, every officer aboard the Continuum watching monitoring stations closely for any sign of response. For nearly 6 hours we received nothing at all, and I remember beginning to wonder if perhaps our carefully planned message had simply vanished into empty space, received by no one at all. Then, finally, a response arrived. It came not from any Grand Council vessel, but from a small scout ship, apparently patrolling the border region on routine surveillance. I remember the confusion in the scout pilot's voice as they responded to our transmission, clearly struggling to understand exactly what they were seeing on their own sensors. "This is Scout Vessel Ren something, requesting confirmation of identity," the voice said, speaking in the same formal Council dialect I had studied so extensively over the years. "Your vessel's configuration does not match any registered species within current Council records. Please clarify your point of origin." I remember our diplomatic lead, a calm and experienced representative named Ambassador Chen, stepping forward to respond personally. "This is Ambassador Wei Chen, representing the Unified Terran Assembly," she said, her voice steady despite the historic weight of the moment. "Our species was formerly known to your Council as humanity, originating from the system known as Sol. We were removed from the Unity Accord several centuries ago. We return now not as a threat, but as a civilization ready to re-establish contact." The silence that followed this exchange stretched on so long that I began to wonder if the connection itself had somehow failed. When the scout pilot's voice finally returned, it carried a tone I can only describe as genuine disbelief. "Humanity," the pilot repeated slowly, as though testing the word for the first time. "The species from the old withdrawal records, you are meant to be—" The voice trailed off, apparently unable to finish whatever assumption they had been about to state. "Extinct?" Ambassador Chen offered gently. "Diminished beyond recovery? I understand your confusion. It has been a very long time since the Council last received any information about our species. I do not know exactly what happened aboard that small scout vessel following our exchange, But within a matter of hours, our sensors detected a significant increase in council communication traffic throughout the surrounding region. Word of our unexpected reappearance was clearly spreading rapidly through official channels, and I remember feeling a mixture of anticipation and unease as we waited for whatever response would eventually arrive. It took nearly 3 days before a proper council delegation arrived to meet with us officially. Time our diplomatic team spent carefully monitoring increasingly frantic communication signals passing through the region, as various council authorities apparently debated how best to respond to our sudden and unexpected return. I learned much later, through historical records compiled after the fact, that our reappearance had triggered significant political turmoil within the council itself, various factions arguing fiercely over whether humanity represented an opportunity for renewed diplomacy or a potential threat requiring immediate and forceful response. When the official council delegation finally arrived, I remember feeling a strange sense of historical symmetry as our diplomatic team prepared to receive them aboard the Continuum. My great-great-grandfather had once stood alone in a room full of judgment, facing a council that held complete power over humanity's fate. Now, generations later, it was the council's turn to arrive uncertain and unprepared, facing a species they had once dismissed as unworthy of their attention. The delegation was led by a council representative named Threll, a name that struck me immediately, given its similarity to the very speaker who had presided over humanity's original withdrawal centuries earlier. I later learned this was, in fact, a direct descendant of that same individual, the position of speaker apparently having remained within certain influential family lines throughout the intervening centuries, much as certain roles had become associated with my own family's legacy among humanity's ranks. Threll's expression, when Ambassador Chen greeted the delegation formally aboard our vessel, carried an unmistakable mixture of caution and barely concealed astonishment. "We were told your species had likely collapsed entirely following the withdrawal," Threll said, studying our diplomatic team with obvious scrutiny. "Our historical records indicate significant instability throughout Sol's system in the years immediately following your removal from the Unity Accord. Our species experienced significant hardship during those early years," Ambassador Chen acknowledged calmly. "But hardship, as it turns out, was not something that destroyed us. It was something that taught us how to build an entirely new future for ourselves, far beyond anything your council's records could have predicted." I watched Threll's expression carefully during this exchange, noting the subtle shift from simple astonishment towards something that looked distinctly like concern. It was clear, even in that first meeting, that our unexpected return had thoroughly disrupted whatever assumptions the council had maintained about humanity's fate over the intervening centuries. The formal message our diplomatic team ultimately delivered to the wider council, transmitted through Threll's delegation back to whatever central authority still governed galactic society, was carefully worded to convey exactly the tone Chancellor Okafor's government had intended from the very beginning. It was not a request. It was not a plea for renewed acceptance into galactic society. It was, simply and clearly, a formal notification. Humanity had returned, and we had returned not as the same struggling species the Council had once judged unworthy of their company, but as something far greater. An entire civilization built through generations of quiet determination, entirely beyond the Council's knowledge or control. I remember standing on the observation deck of the Continuum that evening, watching Threll's delegation depart to carry our message back toward whatever remained of the Council's central authority. I thought of my great-great-grandfather standing alone in the Sun Dome all those generations earlier, delivering his own quiet declaration before a council that held every advantage over him. "You are not casting us out. You are letting us go." Now, generations later, it was humanity who held the advantage, though none of us aboard that vessel yet fully understood exactly how the wider council would respond to our unexpected return. I knew only that whatever came next would shape the future of our entire species, just as surely as that single quiet act of defiance had shaped everything humanity had built since the day we were first cast aside. My name is Kaya Voss, and I was the envoy chosen to stand in the very room where my great-great-grandfather once stood alone, centuries before, and hear our species be cast aside. I have already told you about the Continuum's journey across the old boundary, about our first tense exchange with a council scout vessel, and about the delegation led by a man named Threll who arrived to receive our formal notification of return. What I have not yet told you is what happened in the months that followed, when the council finally summoned a human representative to appear before them in the very chamber known as the Sun Dome, the same room where humanity's fate had once been decided without our consent. I did not expect to be the one chosen for this role. I was, after all, only a communications officer, skilled in old council protocols but never trained as a diplomat in any formal sense. Yet Chancellor Okafor's government made the decision deliberately, understanding the weight that history carried in moments such as these. My family name, carried through 5 generations since Adrian Voss first stood in that same chamber, had become something of a living symbol throughout human society, a reminder that one quiet act of dignity and defeat could eventually shape an entire civilization's future. "You carry his name," Chancellor Okafor told me during our final briefing before departure, her expression thoughtful. "And you carry his understanding of what that room represents. I can think of no one better suited to stand there again." I remember the journey toward Council Prime feeling both familiar and entirely foreign, guided now not by any council escort forcing our return, but by careful invitation extended after months of increasingly serious diplomatic exchange. The station itself had changed little in appearance over the centuries, still built from pieces of 100 different worlds joined together in that same strange, ancient architecture I had only ever seen in old historical records passed down through my family. I remember stepping off our vessel onto the station's main dock, flanked by a small delegation of advisors and security personnel, and feeling the weight of history pressing down upon me in a way I had not fully anticipated. Everywhere I looked, I saw echoes of the stories I had grown up hearing. The corridors my great-great-grandfather had once walked in defeat, the viewing windows where he had once stood alone, uncertain of what future awaited his species. The Sundome itself remained exactly as it had been described in every historical account I had studied. A circular chamber topped with glass that showed the endless stars beyond, surrounded by the same 11 seats reserved for the founding species of the Council, though I noted immediately that several more seats had been added around the outer edges of the chamber, presumably for species who had joined galactic society in the centuries since humanity's withdrawal. Threll, the current speaker and descendant of the same figure who had once presided over our banishment, stood waiting as I entered the chamber. His expression carried none of the polite distance I had read about in historical accounts of his ancestors' demeanor. Instead, I saw something closer to genuine curiosity, mixed with an unmistakable trace of unease. "Envoy Voss," Threll said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet chamber. "The Council welcomes your presence here today." "Thank you, Speaker Threll," I replied, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, despite the significance of the moment. It is a strange thing, to stand in a room I have heard described so many times throughout my life, yet have never actually seen with my own eyes until now. A few of the council delegates shifted slightly at this comment, and I noticed several exchanging glances that suggested they understood exactly what I meant by it. "We are aware," Threll said carefully, "of the history between this chamber and your family, Envoy Voss. Your ancestors' words during the original withdrawal proceedings have, I am told, become something of significance within human historical records." "They have," I confirmed. "You are not casting us out, you are letting us go. Those words have guided my species through every difficult decade since this council chose to sever ties with humanity." I let the statement settle in the silence that followed, watching carefully as several delegates absorbed its meaning. I had been coached extensively by Chancellor Okafor's diplomatic advisors before this meeting, taught to choose every word carefully, understanding that this conversation would shape not only humanity's future relationship with the Council, but quite possibly the wider galaxy's understanding of what our species had truly become. "Envoy Voss," Threll continued, "the Council has reviewed the extensive documentation your government provided regarding humanity's development since the withdrawal. I will admit, the scope of what your species has accomplished during this period has exceeded even our most generous estimates." I noticed a few delegates shifting uncomfortably at this admission, and I understood immediately that not everyone within this chamber shared Threll's apparent willingness toward open acknowledgement. "We have expanded across 43 systems," I said, keeping my tone measured and factual rather than boastful. "We have developed our own faster-than-light technology, entirely independent of any council design. We have established careful, mutually respectful relationships with several independent species along the border regions of our territory, and we have done all of this while deliberately avoiding any contact with council-monitored space, understanding that our return would need to occur entirely on our own terms, when we were finally ready." "A remarkable achievement," Threll acknowledged, "particularly given the circumstances under which your species was originally removed from galactic society." I studied his expression carefully, sensing an opening in his words that I had been specifically prepared to address. "Speaker Threll," I said, "I have studied the original transcripts from my ancestors' final appearance before this council. I understand the official reasoning provided at that time, that humanity was judged unstable, unpredictable, and unfit for continued membership within galactic society. I would like to ask this council directly, do you still believe that judgment was accurate?" The question landed with considerable weight throughout the chamber. I watched several delegates exchange uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge to the council's original decision. It was not Threll who answered first, but a delegate, seated toward the edge of the circle. an elderly being with shimmering blue-green skin that immediately reminded me of descriptions I had read regarding the Ocean World delegate named Koresh, who had spoken kindly to my great-great-grandfather following his own dismissal from this very chamber centuries earlier. "I do not believe it was entirely accurate," the delegate said, and I noted with quiet satisfaction the small nameplate identifying them as a descendant of that same Koresh lineage. My own ancestor voted against the original withdrawal, along with one other delegate. Historical records within my own family suggest the true motivation behind humanity's removal was never truly about instability at all. Then what was it about? I asked, though I already suspected the answer, having studied Koresh's own private conversation with my ancestor, passed down through generations of careful family record-keeping. "Control," the Koresh descendant said simply. "Every species within this council depends upon shared systems maintained collectively over thousands of years. Trade routes, resource distribution, mutual defense agreements. This dependence creates balance, certainly, but it also creates a kind of stability, built upon each species needing the others in order to function properly. Humanity arrived already building independently, solving problems without waiting for permission or guidance from established systems. Some among this council saw that independence not as instability, but as a threat to an order carefully maintained over countless centuries." I noticed Threll's expression tighten slightly at these words, though he did not attempt to interrupt or contradict them. "Is that assessment accurate, Speaker Threll?" I asked directly. Threll was quiet for a long moment before responding. There were certainly delegates within this council, during the original proceedings, who expressed concern regarding humanity's rapid independent development. Whether that concern constituted the primary motivation behind the final decision, I cannot say with absolute certainty, given how many centuries have passed since those original deliberations occurred. I understood, in that careful diplomatic non-answer, exactly how much the council already suspected about the true motivations behind our original banishment. I also understood that pressing the matter further would accomplish little beyond generating unnecessary friction during what remained, at its core, a delicate negotiation over humanity's future relationship with galactic society. "I did not come here today seeking apology or acknowledgement of past wrongdoing," I said instead, shifting the conversation deliberately toward more productive ground. "I came here to establish, clearly and formally, the terms under which humanity is prepared to re-engage with this council, should such engagement prove mutually beneficial." This shift in tone seemed to ease some of the tension that had been building throughout the chamber. Several delegates leaned forward slightly, clearly more comfortable discussing practical matters than confronting uncomfortable historical truths. "Please, Envoy Voss," Threll said, gesturing for me to continue. "The council is prepared to hear your terms." I had spent considerable time preparing this portion of our discussion, working closely alongside Chancellor Okafor's most experienced advisors, to craft an approach that would demonstrate humanity's strength without resorting to unnecessary provocation or aggression. Our government understood clearly that we now possessed something the Council needed just as much as we might benefit from renewed access to wider galactic society. Humanity's territory, I explained, now encompasses a significant portion of the border regions surrounding this Council's traditional sphere of influence. Our 43 systems include several resource-rich worlds unavailable through any current Council trade network. Additionally, our independently developed technology, while different in design philosophy from traditional Council engineering, has proven remarkably resilient and adaptable under conditions that more elegant, precisely calibrated Council systems often struggle to accommodate. I paused, allowing this information to settle before continuing. "Furthermore," I said, "our government has received increasingly frequent reports, through our careful relationships with independent species along the border regions, of growing instability originating from territories well beyond this Council's traditional boundaries. Whatever threat may be developing in that region, humanity's technology and strategic position make us uniquely capable of providing meaningful assistance, should this Council choose to pursue renewed cooperation with our species." I watched carefully as several delegates exchanged glances at this final statement, and I understood immediately that this particular piece of intelligence had struck a nerve I had specifically hoped to address. Our government had learned, through careful diplomatic channels developed over recent months, that the Council had indeed been struggling with certain concerning developments along its outer territories, threats that remained largely unaddressed due to limited resources stretched thin across too many competing priorities. "You are suggesting," Threll said slowly, "that humanity possesses information, or capability, relevant to these developing concerns?" "I am suggesting," I replied carefully, "that humanity is prepared to discuss meaningful cooperation with this Council, on terms that reflect our current standing as an independent and capable civilization, rather than terms dictated entirely by this Council alone. as was the case centuries ago. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy throughout the chamber. I understood, in that moment, that I was witnessing something remarkable, a fundamental shift in the relationship between humanity and the very institution that had once held complete power over our fate. It was Threll who finally broke the silence, his expression carrying an unmistakable mixture of respect and quiet resignation. "Envoy Voss," he said, "I believe this council is prepared to discuss the terms you have outlined, in good faith, and with appropriate recognition of humanity's demonstrated capability and independence." I felt a wave of relief wash through me at these words, though I was careful not to let my expression betray too much satisfaction. Chancellor Okafor's advisors had warned me repeatedly against appearing triumphant during these proceedings, understanding that lasting cooperation required mutual respect rather than the bitter taste of clear victory or defeat. "I am glad to hear it, Speaker Threll," I said simply. "Humanity does not seek to replace this council, nor to diminish its authority throughout the systems it has governed for so many centuries. We seek only recognition as equals, capable of contributing meaningfully to the wider stability of this galaxy, rather than being dismissed as a threat to be contained or controlled." I noticed the Koresh descendant nodding slowly at these words, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that some within this chamber had likely hoped for this exact outcome, ever since their ancestor first cast a lonely, unsuccessful vote against humanity's original banishment. Before concluding my remarks, I found myself recalling the exact words my great-great-grandfather had once spoken in this very chamber, centuries earlier, standing alone before a council that held every advantage over his defeated, uncertain species. "You are not casting us out," I said, allowing my voice to carry clearly through the quiet chamber. "You are letting us go." I paused, watching Threll's expression carefully, before delivering the words I had specifically prepared for this precise moment, the inversion of that original phrase that Chancellor Okafor's advisors and I had crafted together with great care. "Today," I continued, "I say instead that you are not simply welcoming us back. You are recognizing what we always had the capacity to become." The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before it throughout our long, difficult exchange. It was not the heavy silence of judgment, nor the uncertain silence of unresolved tension. It was something closer to quiet acknowledgement, an entire chamber recognizing, perhaps for the first time, exactly what humanity had accomplished during our long absence from galactic society. Threll rose slowly from his seat, and I understood immediately that this gesture carried significant symbolic weight within council tradition. "Envoy Voss," he said, "on behalf of this council, I extend our recognition of humanity's return to galactic society, not as a subordinate member seeking approval, but as an equal partner deserving of this council's genuine respect." I felt the weight of 5 generations settle upon my shoulders in that single moment, the long journey from my great-great-grandfather's quiet defeat to this unexpected, hard-won recognition finally reaching its conclusion. I thought of Elena Voss working tirelessly in that cold laboratory, of Dr. Amir who never lived to see the ships her research made possible, of Captain Tamura's careful patience guiding our expansion through decades of silent growth. Every sacrifice, every failure, every quiet act of stubborn determination throughout our species' long history had led, finally, to this single moment of recognition within the very chamber where our exile had first begun. "Thank you, Speaker Threll," I said quietly. "Humanity looks forward to building a new future alongside this council, one shaped by genuine partnership rather than the fear and misunderstanding that once defined our original parting." As I stood there in the Sundome, surrounded by delegates who had finally acknowledged what humanity had become, I understood that our long, difficult journey since the withdrawal had not simply been about proving ourselves worthy of council approval. It had been about discovering exactly what we were capable of becoming when left entirely to our own devices, and about learning, through generations of struggle and quiet determination, that true strength often emerges most powerfully from circumstances that initially appear to be nothing more than defeat. My name is Kaya Voss, and I am writing these final words many years after that day in the Sundome, now as an old woman looking back on a life that became far larger than I ever expected it to be. I have told you, across these many accounts passed down through my family and my own recorded memories, the story of humanity's long journey from banishment to recognition. I told you about my great-great-grandfather Adrian, who stood alone before the council and spoke words that would echo through generations. I told you about Elena, who helped build the very engines that carried us beyond our home system. I told you about the quiet decades of expansion, the careful contact with independent species, and finally, the day I stood in that same chamber and heard the council acknowledge what we had become. But a story does not end simply because a single meeting concludes, no matter how significant that meeting might be. I want to use these final pages to tell you what came after, and to offer whatever wisdom I have gathered after a long life spent watching humanity find its true place among the stars. The years immediately following my meeting with Speaker Threll were neither simple nor without difficulty. Recognition from the Council did not mean instant trust, nor did it erase centuries of careful separation between our two civilizations. There were many within the Council who remained deeply uncertain about humanity's true intentions, just as there were many among our own people who carried old resentments too deep to easily set aside. Trust, I learned during those years, is rarely built through single dramatic moments. It is built slowly, through countless small choices made consistently over time. Chancellor Okafor's government, working alongside the diplomatic teams I helped establish following my return from Council Prime, spent nearly a decade carefully building the framework for what would eventually become known as the Meridian Accord, a new agreement governing cooperation between humanity and the wider Council. Unlike the original Unity Accord that had once bound us to Council authority as a junior dependent member, this new agreement recognized humanity as a fully independent civilization, choosing to cooperate with the Council out of mutual benefit rather than obligation or hierarchy. I remember the early years of this cooperation being marked by considerable caution on both sides. Council representatives visiting our territories often seemed surprised, even now, by the scale and sophistication of what humanity had built during our long absence. I remember hosting a delegation from the Council's Engineering Council, scholars eager to study our layered field technology, the very design Dr. Amir had first theorized in that cold, cluttered warehouse laboratory so many generations earlier. They found our approach clumsy by their own elegant standards, yet undeniably effective in ways their own more refined systems often struggled to match, particularly in situations requiring adaptability under difficult or unpredictable conditions. In turn, humanity gained access to certain Council resources and knowledge we had been denied during our original limited membership within the Unity Accord. Though our government approached this new access carefully, unwilling to abandon the independent spirit that had carried us through our long isolation, we adopted what proved useful, while remaining firmly committed to our own particular way of solving problems, the same stubborn, adaptable philosophy that had defined humanity since the earliest days following our withdrawal. The threat I had mentioned during my original meeting with Speaker Threll, the growing instability along the Council's outer territories, proved to be a significant turning point in solidifying trust between our two civilizations. Within just a few years of the Meridian Accord's establishment, that instability grew into a genuine crisis, a previously unknown force emerging from beyond even the furthest edges of explored space, threatening several vulnerable systems along the Council's borders. I will not spend these final pages describing that particular conflict in great detail, as it deserves its own separate telling, one perhaps better suited to a different account entirely. What I will say is that humanity's unique technology and strategic position, developed entirely independently during our long isolation, proved absolutely essential in helping stabilize the situation. Our ships, built for resilience and adaptability rather than pure elegance, performed remarkably well under conditions that challenged even the Council's most sophisticated vessels. Our willingness to embrace unconventional solutions, born from generations spent solving problems without any established guidance, allowed us to respond effectively to threats that more traditional Council thinking initially struggled to address. By the time that crisis was finally resolved, several years after it first began, any remaining doubt among Council leadership regarding humanity's value as an equal partner had been thoroughly settled. We had not simply proven ourselves capable of surviving independently, as we had already demonstrated through our long silent expansion. We had proven ourselves capable of contributing meaningfully to the safety and stability of the wider galaxy, exactly as Chancellor Okafor had once envisioned when she first made the decision to end humanity's long silence among the stars. I served for many years following those events as humanity's primary liaison to the Council, a role that took me back to the Sundome more times than I can easily count. I watched the chamber slowly transform over those years, additional seats added as more species joined the growing partnership between independent civilizations and the traditional Council structure, a transformation that historians would eventually come to call the New Concordance, distinct from the original Unity Accord that had once governed galactic society so rigidly. Humanity did not seek to replace the Council during this transformation, nor did we seek to dominate the new structure that gradually emerged. Instead, we became something the Council itself had perhaps never expected, a bridge between the old, established order and a newer, more flexible approach to cooperation among the galaxy's many different species. Our own history of exclusion and quiet resilience gave us a particular understanding of what it meant to be dismissed as unworthy, an understanding that made us uniquely suited to advocate for other smaller, independent species who found themselves in similar circumstances during this new era of expanding galactic cooperation. I think often of Koresh, the ocean world delegate who spoke kindly to my great-great-grandfather all those centuries earlier, and of that delegate's descendant who spoke so honestly during my own meeting with Speaker Threll. I made a point, throughout my years serving as liaison, of maintaining a close friendship with that particular family line, understanding that their quiet courage during humanity's darkest moment had helped preserve some small thread of decency within an institution that had otherwise failed us so completely. I like to think that friendship, small as it may have seemed against the vast scale of galactic politics, represented something important about how genuine change often begins, not through grand, dramatic gestures, but through individuals willing to quietly stand against injustice, even when their voice alone cannot change the final outcome. My own daughter, Marisol, chose to follow a path similar to my own, eventually serving as humanity's ambassador to several of the newer species who joined the expanding concordance during the decades following the crisis along the Council's borders. I remember watching her deliver her very first formal address within the Sun Dome, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride mixed with something closer to quiet wonder at how far our family's journey had come since that first fateful day when Adrian Voss stood alone in that same chamber, uncertain of what future awaited his species. I asked her once, many years later, what she felt standing in that room for the first time, knowing everything our family had endured to eventually earn a place of genuine respect within it. I felt gratitude, she told me, not simply for what we accomplished, but for what we learned along the way. I do not think we would have become what we are today if the Council had never cast us aside in the first place. I think, in some strange way, they gave us exactly what we needed, even though it was never their intention to do so. I have thought about her words many times since, and I believe she captured something true about the entire arc of our species' long journey. The Council's original decision to banish humanity was born from fear and a desire to maintain control over an order they had carefully built over thousands of years. They intended it as a punishment, a way of removing an unpredictable variable from their carefully balanced system. Instead, that decision became the very catalyst that allowed humanity to discover exactly what we were capable of becoming, free from any outside influence or control. I do not believe humanity would have developed our particular resilience, our stubborn creativity, our willingness to embrace imperfect solutions when elegant ones proved impossible, had we remained comfortably dependent upon Council support throughout those centuries. Our exile forced us to learn things about ourselves that we might never have discovered otherwise, lessons written not in careful, guided study, but in hard-won experience earned through genuine struggle. I am an old woman now, writing these words from a quiet home on New Meridian, the same agricultural world where I grew up listening to my grandmother's stories about ancestors I would never meet. I have lived long enough to see humanity transform from a struggling, isolated species clinging to survival within a single solar system into a respected and valued partner within a galaxy-spanning community of independent civilizations. I have watched the Sun Dome itself change from a chamber of judgment into something closer to a genuine council of equals, each species bringing their own particular strengths to a shared vision of cooperation that the original council could never have imagined during the rigid, hierarchical years of the old Unity Accord. Sometimes, when I sit quietly in the evenings watching the stars from my window, I think about that single moment in the Sun Dome, centuries ago, when my great-great-grandfather stood alone before a council that saw him as nothing more than a representative of a flawed, unstable species unworthy of their company. I think about the quiet dignity with which he accepted that judgment, refusing to plead or beg for mercy he knew would never be granted. I think about the simple words he spoke instead, words that would eventually become the foundation for everything humanity built during our long, difficult journey back to the stars. You are not casting us out. You are letting us go. I think too about the words I spoke standing in that same chamber, generations later, finally able to offer a different kind of truth born from everything our species had accomplished during our long absence. You are not simply welcoming us back. You are recognizing what we always had the capacity to become. I do not know what challenges still await humanity in the centuries ahead, nor what further growth or difficulty our species might yet encounter as we continue building our place within this vast and complicated galaxy. But I know, with a certainty earned through generations of hard-won experience, that whatever comes next, humanity will face it the same way we have always faced every challenge, since the day we were first cast aside, with stubborn determination, with quiet resilience, with an unwavering belief that even the darkest exile can become the foundation for something far greater than anyone, even the very species who imposed that exile upon us, could have ever imagined. We were told we were not ready for the stars. Perhaps, in that first difficult winter so long ago, we truly were not. But we did not simply wait for someone else to decide when we were ready. We built our own readiness, through failure and struggle and quiet, patient determination. until the day finally arrived when we no longer needed anyone's permission to claim our rightful place among the countless stars that had once seemed so impossibly far beyond our reach. That, I believe, is the truest lesson of our long, difficult journey. Not simply that humanity proved the Council wrong, though we certainly did, but that we discovered, through every hardship and every quiet act of stubborn resilience, exactly what we were always capable of becoming, if only given the time and the reason to try. I close these final pages with the same hope my great-great-grandfather must have carried with him all those centuries ago, standing alone in that quiet chamber, uncertain of what future awaited a species suddenly cast adrift among the stars. I hope that whoever reads these words, whether human or otherwise, understands that the truest measure of any civilization is never found in the judgments passed upon it by others, but in what it chooses to build for itself, when given nothing more than time, determination, and the simple, stubborn belief that a better future remains always within reach. We were banished once, centuries ago, cast aside as unworthy of the stars. We return now, and forever, as exactly what we always had the capacity to become.